March 22, 1945. 10:47 p.m. A farmhouse outside Oppenheim, Germany. General George S. Patton Jr. stood in a candlelit room, mud still caked on his boots, staring at a map spread across a wooden table that had belonged to a German family now fled or dead. Behind him, his staff officers waited in silence, their faces drawn tight with exhaustion and something else, anticipation mixed with dread. Patton's hand hovered over the Rhine River, his finger tracing the blue line that represented the last great barrier between the Allied forces and the heart of Nazi Germany. He had just done something extraordinarily dangerous, something that would either be remembered as brilliant or result in his court-martial. He had crossed the Rhine without permission, without air support, without the elaborate preparations his supreme commander had demanded. And now, somewhere in France, in the palatial headquarters of SHAF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Dwight D. Eisenhower was about to find out. The tension between these two men had been building for years, a slow-burning fuse that combined friendship, rivalry, tactical genius, and volcanic temper. What happened in the hours and days that followed would not only define their relationship but would illuminate one of the most complex command dynamics of World War II, a collision between caution and audacity, between political necessity and warrior instinct, between the man who had to win the war and the man who wanted to win it his way, no matter the cost. To understand what Eisenhower said when Patton disobeyed him, you have to go back. Back to when they were young officers, back to when the world was different and war was still theoretical. Back to 1919, when both men were stationed at Camp Meade in Maryland, experimenting with tanks, dreaming of mechanized warfare while their superiors dismissed them as fools playing with expensive toys. They had been friends then, genuine friends, united by their vision of how future wars would be fought. Eisenhower was methodical, diplomatic, blessed with an ability to navigate the treacherous waters of military politics. Patton was fire and brimstone, a man who believed war was humanity's highest calling, who read ancient military texts in their original languages and wept openly at the beauty of a well-executed cavalry charge. But friendship, even deep friendship, becomes complicated when one man rises faster than the other. When World War II erupted and America was finally dragged into the inferno, Eisenhower's political acumen and strategic brilliance catapulted him to supreme command. Patton, for all his tactical genius, was given armies to command but always under someone else's ultimate authority. Always under Ike's authority. And Patton, whose ego was as legendary as his pearl-handled revolvers, chafed under any restraint. Their first major confrontation had come in Sicily in 1943. Patton had slapped two soldiers suffering from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder but what was then called cowardice or battle fatigue. The incidents had been kept quiet initially, but when they leaked to the press, the scandal threatened to destroy Patton's career. Eisenhower had been forced to choose, lose one of his most aggressive commanders or weather the political storm. He had chosen to save Patton, but at a cost. A formal apology. A humiliating tour of apologies to every division in the 7th Army. Eisenhower's message had been clear: I need you, but you are not indispensable. You will follow orders. You will control yourself. Patton had learned nothing from this episode, or perhaps he had learned the wrong lesson, that Eisenhower would always protect him in the end, that his value as a combat commander would always outweigh his sins. Through North Africa, through Sicily, through the nightmare of the Falaise Gap in France, Patton had pushed, prodded, and occasionally outright ignored directives from Supreme Headquarters. He competed openly with British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, turned supply requisitions into personal feuds, and treated warfare like a personal crusade where he was both knight and king. Eisenhower had tolerated this because Patton won battles. Because when you needed someone to punch through German lines, to move faster and hit harder than the enemy thought possible, you sent Patton. He was a weapon, and weapons don't need to be diplomatic. But weapons can be dangerous to the hand that wields them, and by the spring of 1945, that danger was becoming impossible to ignore. The Third Army had carved a path of destruction across France and into Germany that was both magnificent and terrifying. Patton drove his men relentlessly, sleeping only a few hours each night, visiting frontline units with a regularity that terrified his security detail, appearing suddenly in command posts with that ivory-handled revolver on his hip and that look in his eyes that promised either glory or death. His soldiers feared him and loved him in equal measure, understanding that he would spend their lives without hesitation but also that he would never ask them to go anywhere he wouldn't lead them. The officers who served directly under Patton lived in a constant state of nervous energy, never quite sure when the general would arrive or what impossible task he would demand. He had a gift for appearing at exactly the moment when a unit was bogging down, when momentum was being lost, when comfortable assumptions were replacing aggressive action. He would stride into headquarters, scan the maps with those cold blue eyes, and within minutes identify what needed to be done. Sometimes he was wrong, but he was wrong with such absolute conviction that men found themselves following orders they knew were questionable simply because Patton believed in them so completely. This was the man who now stood looking at that map in Oppenheim, knowing he had just committed an act that would either vindicate his entire philosophy of warfare or end his military career. The decision to cross the Rhine had not been made impulsively. Patton had been studying the river for weeks, looking for the moment and the place where he could strike. He had positioned his forces carefully, stockpiling boats and bridging equipment while claiming they were for routine river operations. He had told just enough of his subordinates to make the operation possible while keeping it quiet enough that word wouldn't reach SHAEF until it was too late to stop him. The night of March 22 had been cold and moonless, perfect conditions for a crossing that depended on surprise. The 5th Infantry Division had moved to the riverbank in darkness, their weapons wrapped to prevent noise, their conversations reduced to hand signals and whispered commands. The first boats had pushed off from shore with men who knew they might be rowing toward a hail of German fire, that the opposite bank could erupt at any moment with machine guns and mortars that would turn the Rhine into a killing ground. But the German defenders, stretched thin and demoralized after months of retreat, had failed to detect the crossing until it was well underway. By dawn, American infantry were digging in on the eastern bank, establishing a perimeter that grew stronger with each hour. Engineers worked frantically to construct a pontoon bridge, knowing that the bridgehead would remain vulnerable until vehicles and heavy weapons could cross. German artillery began to range in by mid-morning, but by then it was too late. The Americans were across in sufficient force that any counterattack would require resources the Wehrmacht simply no longer possessed. Patton had gambled that the Germans would be unprepared, that speed would compensate for lack of preparation, and he had been proven right. The casualties had been remarkably light, fewer than 40 men killed or wounded in the initial crossing, a number so low that it seemed almost miraculous compared to what everyone had expected. Staff officers who had privately believed the operation was reckless now found themselves amazed at Patton's judgment. The Germans had been caught completely off guard, their attention focused on Montgomery's elaborate preparations to the north, and Patton had exploited that distraction with ruthless efficiency. But military success and professional propriety were two different things, and Patton knew that what he had done was in direct violation of his orders. Eisenhower had been explicit. Montgomery's crossing was to be the main effort. Patton's Third Army would cross only after Montgomery was established, only with full coordination, only as part of the larger plan. These orders had been given verbally, confirmed in writing, and repeated through multiple channels specifically because Eisenhower knew Patton's tendencies. The Supreme Commander had tried to anticipate this exact situation and prevent it. Patton had circumvented those orders through a combination of technical sophistry and operational boldness. He had claimed he was simply maintaining aggressive patrolling, probing enemy defenses, seizing opportunities as they presented themselves. He had not technically requested permission to cross the Rhine because he had characterized his operation as something less than a formal river crossing, even though everyone involved knew exactly what it was. It was the kind of bureaucratic maneuvering that Patton usually despised in others but employed without hesitation when it served his purposes. The telephone call to SHAEF headquarters was delayed as long as possible. Patton wanted the bridgehead absolutely secure, wanted the bridge completed, wanted the situation on the ground so solid that there could be no possibility of being ordered to withdraw. He understood Eisenhower well enough to know that his old friend would be furious but also that Ike would have to deal with the military and political realities of the situation. Once American forces were across the Rhine in strength, pulling them back would be both dangerous and embarrassing. The Supreme Commander would have to accept what had been done and manage the consequences. When the call finally went through, Patton adopted that tone of innocent accomplishment that fooled no one but allowed everyone to maintain the necessary fictions. His voice carried just the right mixture of pride and casualness, as if crossing the Rhine ahead of schedule and without permission was a minor deviation rather than a major insubordination. "Ike, I want to report that we crossed the Rhine last night. Minimal casualties. Bridge is going in now. We're across and staying across." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. Those in the room with Patton could hear the tension in that silence, could imagine Eisenhower's face as he processed what he had just been told. The Supreme Commander was dealing with dozens of critical issues simultaneously, coordinating operations across hundreds of miles of front, managing relationships with Churchill and the British High Command, preparing for the political complexities of occupation and the end of the war. And now Patton had just complicated everything with a brilliant act of disobedience. When Eisenhower finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled, each word measured and deliberate. Those who knew him recognized this as the sign that he was containing volcanic anger, that the famous Eisenhower temper was being held in check through sheer force of will. He could have exploded, could have relieved Patton on the spot, could have made this a formal disciplinary matter. Instead, he chose a different approach. "Congratulations, George. That's excellent work. But don't tell anyone about it just yet. Montgomery's operation is scheduled for tomorrow, and I don't want the press making comparisons that will create problems with our British allies. We'll announce both crossings together." It was a masterpiece of command politics, a response that simultaneously acknowledged achievement, maintained authority, and attempted to minimize diplomatic damage. In those few sentences, Eisenhower had done what he always did, he had found a way to turn a problem into an advantage while keeping the Allied coalition functioning. But he wasn't finished. "George, we need to be very clear about something. What you did was in direct violation of the orders I gave you. I understand the tactical opportunity, and I recognize that your operation was successful. But you deliberately maneuvered around explicit instructions from this headquarters. That cannot happen again. Do you understand me?" Patton's response, recorded later in his diary with characteristic self-justification, acknowledged the reprimand while defending his actions. He argued that he had seen an opportunity that fit within the spirit of his orders even if it violated the letter. He pointed out that his crossing had been achieved with minimal casualties compared to what Montgomery's elaborate operation would likely suffer. He suggested that aggressive commanders had to be given latitude to exploit unexpected opportunities, that warfare was too fluid and complex to be run entirely from rear headquarters. It was all true, and it was all irrelevant to the core issue. Eisenhower knew that Patton had deliberately evaded his orders. Patton knew that Eisenhower knew. The question was what would be done about it, and the answer revealed everything about how Eisenhower managed his most difficult subordinate. There would be no formal reprimand, no entry in Patton's personnel file, no court-martial or investigation. Publicly, the Rhine crossing at Oppenheim would be celebrated as another example of American military prowess, proof that aggressive leadership could achieve remarkable results. Privately, the staff officers at SHAEF would make certain that Patton understood he had exhausted whatever credit the success had earned him. The next violation would not be forgiven. The protection that Eisenhower had extended through multiple scandals and controversies was wearing thin, and even Patton's considerable tactical abilities might not be enough to save him if he continued to treat orders as suggestions. The political dimension of the situation was enormously complex. The Americans were delighted that an American general had beaten Montgomery across the Rhine, that Patton's rough-and-ready approach had achieved more with less than the British field marshal's elaborate preparations. The British, already sensitive about their declining military contribution compared to the massive American buildup in Europe, saw the Oppenheim crossing as a calculated insult, a way of stealing Montgomery's thunder and making him look slow and overcautious by comparison. Eisenhower spent the next several days managing these diplomatic tensions while simultaneously dealing with the military implications of having two major Rhine crossings happening nearly simultaneously. He had to reassure Churchill that American operations were not diminishing British contributions. He had to reassure Roosevelt and Marshall that he was maintaining discipline within the American command structure. He had to coordinate with Montgomery to ensure that the British crossing proceeded smoothly despite the unexpected competition from Patton. It was exhausting work, the kind of political-military balancing act that Patton not only couldn't do but actively despised. This fundamental difference in how the two men approached command was at the heart of their complex relationship. Eisenhower understood that modern warfare was as much about logistics, politics, and alliance management as it was about battlefield tactics. He knew that winning the war required keeping the British committed, maintaining American public support, and positioning the Allies for the post-war world that was already beginning to take shape. Patton saw all of this as weakness, as bureaucratic interference with the pure business of fighting. He believed that if you just kept attacking, kept pushing, kept refusing to accept limitations, victory would follow inevitably. Both men were right within their spheres. Eisenhower's political skill and strategic patience had built the alliance that made victory possible. Patton's tactical aggression and refusal to accept obstacles had made that victory happen faster and at lower cost than more cautious approaches would have allowed. But these complementary strengths also meant that the two men would inevitably clash, that Patton would push beyond what Eisenhower could accept and Eisenhower would restrain Patton in ways that the combat general found intolerable. The Rhine crossing was not the end of their conflicts. Within weeks, Patton was advocating for a drive toward Czechoslovakia, arguing that American forces should reach Prague before the Soviets. This was no longer just a military question but a deeply political one, touching on the agreements that had been made at Yalta about post-war spheres of influence. Eisenhower, following the guidance he had received from Roosevelt and the combined chiefs of staff, ordered Patton to halt his advance and allow Soviet forces to liberate Prague. Patton complied with the order but made his feelings abundantly clear to anyone who would listen, telling reporters that they were handing Central Europe to the communists, that American blood was being wasted because politicians lacked the courage to face Soviet expansionism. These comments, while they reflected the opinions of many American officers, were politically explosive and put Eisenhower in an impossible position. The Supreme Commander was trying to maintain cooperation with the Soviets during the final weeks of the war, trying to ensure that the German surrender would be coordinated and that the occupation would proceed smoothly. Patton's public criticism of Allied policy undermined these efforts and gave ammunition to those who wanted to see him removed from command. The final break came after the war ended, when Patton's inability to govern his public statements created one scandal too many. His comments comparing the Nazi Party to American political parties, his slow denazification of the Bavarian region under his control, and his continued advocacy for aggressive policies toward the Soviet Union all combined to make him a political liability. Eisenhower, who had protected Patton through multiple controversies, finally concluded that his old friend could no longer be allowed to command troops. The relief of command was done as gently as possible, with Patton given a face-saving position overseeing military history, but it was still a humiliation for a man who had lived for combat command. Patton's death in December 1945, just months after being relieved, added a tragic dimension to the story. The car accident that killed him seemed almost absurdly anticlimactic for a man who had survived 2 world wars without serious injury. Some speculated about conspiracy, but the evidence suggested nothing more than bad luck in icy roads. Patton, who had charged into German fire without hesitation, died because of a traffic accident in occupied Germany. Eisenhower's tribute to Patton after his death was generous, praising his tactical genius and his contributions to Allied victory. But those who knew both men understood that the relationship had been fundamentally damaged long before Patton's death, that the Rhine crossing had been a turning point that neither man could fully move past. Eisenhower had learned that Patton could not be controlled, only managed and eventually contained. Patton had learned that even spectacular success could not fully compensate for disobedience, that the political dimensions of warfare were real even if he refused to acknowledge them. The legacy of that telephone conversation in March 1945 extends far beyond the specific circumstances of World War II. It represents an eternal tension in military affairs between centralized control and individual initiative, between following established plans and adapting to unexpected opportunities. Military academies still teach the Rhine crossing as a case study, asking young officers to consider what they would have done in Patton's position, whether they would have seized the opportunity or followed orders. They ask what they would have done in Eisenhower's position, how they would have balanced the need for discipline against the reality of tactical success. There are no simple answers to these questions because they involve competing values that are both essential to military effectiveness. An army that rigidly follows plans regardless of changing circumstances will be defeated by more flexible opponents. But an army where commanders routinely ignore orders based on their own judgment will collapse into chaos. The art of command lies in knowing when to insist on obedience and when to accept initiative, when to punish deviation and when to reward results. Eisenhower and Patton represented the two poles of this tension in their most extreme forms. Eisenhower was the supreme manager, the political general who could coordinate vast operations and maintain complex alliances. Patton was the warrior incarnate, the commander who believed that audacity and will could overcome any obstacle. The war needed both of them, but it also needed them to be in a hierarchical relationship where one commanded and the other obeyed, even when that obedience was reluctant and incomplete. What Eisenhower said when Patton disobeyed him was ultimately less important than what he did. He accepted the success. While making clear that the method was unacceptable, he protected the alliance while maintaining his authority. He kept the army functioning while managing his most difficult subordinate. It was not a perfect solution because no perfect solution existed. It was a pragmatic acceptance of reality, an acknowledgement that winning the war required tolerating behavior that would be unacceptable in any other context. The farmhouse in Oppenheim still stands, though few visitors realize its significance. The Rhine continues to flow, now crossed by modern bridges that carry thousands of vehicles daily, a peaceful river that once represented the last barrier before the heart of Nazi Germany. The pontoon bridge that Patton's engineers built disappeared long ago, recycled or destroyed, leaving no physical trace of that night when American infantry paddled across dark water expecting death at any moment. But the memory remains, preserved in official histories and personal memoirs, in the lectures given at military academies and the debates among historians. It remains because it captures something essential about command, about the relationship between leaders who must cooperate even when they fundamentally disagree about how wars should be fought. It remains because both men were right and both were wrong, because the tension between them represented a necessary creative friction that made victory possible even as it made their relationship impossible. What Eisenhower said when Patton disobeyed him echoes across the decades not as a definitive answer but as an illustration of an eternal problem. How do we manage the brilliant, difficult people whose talents we need but whose behavior we cannot fully control? How do we balance the requirements of discipline against the needs of initiative? How do we win wars while maintaining the values and structures that make victory meaningful? These questions have no final answers. They are negotiated fresh in every conflict, in every organization, wherever talented people work under imperfect systems toward difficult goals. Eisenhower and Patton simply played out this negotiation on a stage where the stakes could not have been higher, where their decisions shaped not just their own fates but the future of the world. And history, imperfect judge that it is, remembers them both, the supreme commander who had to manage victory and the army commander who had to win it, forever linked by a river crossed without permission and words spoken over a telephone line that tried to bridge the unbridgeable gap between order and chaos, between discipline and genius, between what was commanded and what was done.